little bit strange. Actually, it's still a little bit strange. So this video is going to be in 2 parts, assuming that it doesn't cut off on me again. Anyway, let's get going so that if it does, it's not a big deal. We were talking about basso continuo. We have a keyboard instrument, and then we also have another instrument, and that's usually a cello, although sometimes it's a bassoon that plays along. And it plays what's called figured bass. So if you're playing the keyboard, your left hand would be playing the notes that are written, the bass part, and then it's going to have numbers that symbolize different chords, and your right hand is just supposed to improvise notes that fit within those chords. It's called figured bass, and it's the way they wrote the basso continuo part of the day. Words and music, we have, again, text painting, or I think in the last part they called it word painting. It's the same idea, conveying the music, conveying through the music the words that are going on at the time. You have things like descending chromatic scales being associated with pain and grief. Climbing mountains would go up. Heaven might be set to a high tone, and hell might be set to a low one. I think those are some of the ones your textbook uses. Baroque composers often, you'll notice, would emphasize different words by using a lot of notes in really quick succession. And it emphasized the part, for one, and 2, it would display how amazing the singer was that they could sing this crazy stuff. We have what was called the Baroque orchestra. There's a picture in the PowerPoint of a Baroque orchestra, and you can see the different parts. It has a harpsichord in there. And you will notice that it's pretty small, anywhere from 10 to 30 players, your textbook says is the normal size, or 10 to 40 would be the number of the Baroque orchestra. You have the basso continuo was the part that had to be there, along with some of the upper strings. And you also had, depending on the piece, some woodwinds, some brass, maybe some percussion. One that was often used was the trumpet, and Baroque trumpets were very common to add. Baroque trumpets didn't have any valves like our modern trumpets do, so they're a lot harder to play. And so they were held in very high esteem by the Baroque orchestra, and you'll hear lots of solo work for the Baroque trumpet. We have different forms of music that we use in the Baroque period. We have pieces with different movements in them, and a movement is a piece, it's a part of a piece that sounds complete, but it's part of a larger composition. So you might have 3 small movements that make up an entire piece. So you might have, and they're often played by themselves. So it would be like, I'm trying to think of something that it would be like. It would be in a soundtrack. You know, you have the different pieces, and you can play them independently, but they're part of one soundtrack. So a piece was a little more cohesive than a soundtrack would be, but it's that same sort of idea. You have little separate pieces that are all part of one big piece. So they're called movements. Usually each movement has its own themes. Usually some of them are fast, some of them are slow. And all of these movements would be packaged together in different types of pieces. Maybe it would be concerto, maybe it would be a sonata, maybe it would be an opera, but each one of these has little mini movements inside of it. We have, just like we used to, we have the 3-part and the 2-part forms. 3-part we'd have theme A, theme B, and theme A again, and then 2-part would be theme A and theme B. And then we also have what we call the continuous or undivided, is the term that your textbook calls it. We call it through composed. So just a piece that's played through with no repeating material at all. So there's no recurring A theme. It doesn't come back at all. It's called through composed. Let's talk really briefly about music in the Baroque Society. This is number 2 in your book on page 106 and 107. Most music in the Baroque era was written, what we call written to order. So somebody would ask, they would contact a composer and say, hey, I'm having a party at my house, would you write some music for it? People didn't really like listening to old music. Everything had to be new, everything had to be unique. And so the composers did a lot of writing for the nobility, for the people that could afford to have music written for them. And of course, in the aristocracy with the nobility, music was a big thing that they would do during their leisure time. They would hire, goodness. They would hire a staff of organists. They would have, your textbook says on page 106, one court might imply an orchestra, a chapel choir, and opera singers. And the size of these different groups would depend on how wealthy the patron was. So if you were very wealthy, you would hire lots of musicians. If you were not so wealthy, you would just hire a few. The music director was the one who composed most of the music. He supervised the performances. He looked out for the players of the orchestra. And he was very overworked, but he also had a lot of job satisfaction too, because all of the music that he wrote would be performed, and he had a big outlet for his creativity. The composer, even though they were looked well upon, they were still a servant. They still had to ask permission if they wanted to leave. If they wanted to accept a new job, they had to ask. And so they were still considered to be a servant. They weren't really middle class, although they sort of lived like it. Some rulers were also good musicians. Frederick the Great was the king of Prussia, and he was a very good flutist. He's the example that your textbook uses. Quantz was his flute teacher, and he was always very impressed by Frederick the Great's skill. Churches also needed music, and a lot of musicians found themselves working for the church. The pay wasn't as good, but it was also a good job to have. Many Baroque churches had orchestras, choirs, they would have an organist, and it was here that most of the citizens really heard music, because concerts weren't very popular, and of course they wouldn't be invited to the nobility to hear music there. So the music director would also compose new music so that his congregants could hear all of the new things that he was composing. Some Baroque musicians also earned money by writing operas for commercial opera houses that we'll see later. This was done a lot in Venice. And your textbook says on page 107, in Venice, a city of 125,000 people, 6 opera companies performed simultaneously between 1680 and 1700. So that's a lot of opera, and we're going to talk in just a minute about opera and about how that all started. But before we talk about opera, we're going to talk about the Concerto Grosso and fugue. The Concerto Grosso is a small group of soloists. You have about 2 to 4 soloists, and then you have a group of players. They're called the tutti, and they are you can have anywhere from 8 to 20 of them. And in what's called ritornello form, which a lot of concerto grossos are written in, especially the first and the third movement, which are the fast movements, tend to be written in ritornello form. You'll have the small group of soloists, and then you'll have the tutti, or the large group, and they'll go back and forth. So your textbook defines ritornello form on page 108. It says the first and last movements of a concerto grossi are often in ritornello form, which is based on an alteration between tutti and solo sections. So the tutti opens with a theme called the ritornello, or the refrain, and then it might come in and starting on different notes. It might come in with different dynamics, played by different instruments, but it's going to always be that same theme that comes back again and again and again. We're going to hear an example of Concerto Grosso. This one was written by the most famous musician from the Baroque era. You might have heard of him, Johann Sebastian Bach. And this is his Brandenburg Concerto number 5. It's in D. Oh, the different movements were fast, slow, and fast. I kind of referred to that, but I didn't specifically mention it. This is Bach's Brandenburg Concerto number 5. It's in D major. He wrote it around 1721, your textbook says. And he wrote it for the Margrave of Brandenburg. So again, he wrote it for the nobility. At the time, he worked for the prince in Cöthen, and so this piece was originally performed there. It's thought the prince had gotten a new harpsichord, and there's a little bit of an unusual harpsichord solo in here, And so the idea is that Bach was probably trying to show off the new harpsichord and a little bit of his mad keyboard skills at the same time. The Margrave met Bach in 1718 when he was director of music for another one of his patrons, and he loved Bach's music and asked Bach to send him some of his compositions. And about 3 years later, Bach sent him a set of Brandenburg concertos, and they had a very flattering dedication your textbook mentions. Probably Bach was hoping to receive some sort of money or favor in return. I don't know whether he ever got them. I don't know that anybody does, but that's kind of the backstory to some of these Brandenburg concertos. So this is, we're going to listen, which one are we going to listen to? We're going to listen to the first movement. This is in ritornello form, so I want you to listen for the difference. I want you to listen to two things. I want you to listen to the difference between the solo group of 2 to 4 instruments and the tutti, or the ensemble, and you'll be able to see that in the video, see who's playing what. And I want you to listen for the main theme, which is that first section at the beginning. So listen for those two things, the difference between the small group and the large group, and listen for the main theme and how many times it comes back, because it comes back quite a few times. Go ahead and pause the video and listen to that first movement from the Brandenburg Concerto, which should be on a playlist that I posted to the announcements section of Canvas. Bach's music is a ton of fun. It's very fast. It never stops for a breath, but he has some amazing music. We're going to listen to some more of it a little bit later when we talk about his life. For now, we're going to go on. Actually, we're going to go on and continue to talk about Bach, and we're going to talk about Bach by talking about the fugue, which Bach was a master of. If you look on page 111 in your textbook, it says, a fugue is a polyphonic composition based on one main theme, and that main theme is called a subject. And you have different voices or melodic lines that get a chance to imitate the subject. So remember we talked about imitation. A fugue is a little bit like a round in the idea that you're going to have a main theme that's played by, let's say, the soprano, and then the alto is going to pick it up and play it, and then the tenor is going to pick it up and play it, and then the bass is going to pick it up and play it in no particular order. The form of a fugue, you can kind of do anything you want with it, but there are some basic rules and some basic things that have to be there. So the first one that we talk about is that we have the subject is the main theme of the fugue, and then the voices are not like voices meaning that you sing it, but the voices are the lines that imitate the subject. So if I'm playing a fugue on the organ, I would have maybe the subject would be in my right hand, and then maybe I'd have another voice that I play in my right hand, and then I'd have another voice that I play in my left hand, and maybe if we're feeling really adventuresome, we're going to put 2 voices in the left hand, so I have 2 voices in my right hand and 2 voices in my left hand. And then because it's the organ, there's a pedal board, and I get to have a voice for the feet. And each one has its own separate line. So my right hand is playing 2 separate lines of music. I mean, they won't be on separate staves, but they'll put them on the same staff since they're going to be on the same line, but it's 2 different lines. And then my left hand is going to have 2 independent lines of music, and then my feet will have an independent line of music. And that would be what we call a 5-voice fugue. There are a couple different things, the distinctions between rounds and fugues. They're similar, but they're not the same. First of all, imitation doesn't continue indefinitely. So you might have voices that are repeating themes, but it's not going to keep going. Like if you do a round with 3 blind mice, it can just kind of keep going, and you can add more and more, and it never stops. There's a limit. Each voice sort of gets its one chance, and then you play some new material, and then maybe each voice will get its one chance again, and then you play some new material. By the way, the new material is called episodes. Episodes, new material, fragments of the subject's counter-subject. So you might do each voice gets a chance, and then do an episode, and then each voice gets a chance, and then you have another episode. You also have what we call counter-subjects. Counter-subjects are a melodic idea that always accompanies the subject. So whenever you hear the subject, keep an eye or an ear out for listening for the counter-subject, which is something that will come along with it. It might be in the feet, It might be in the hands, it might be on a different instrument, but it's always going to be there. Stretto, there are a couple different things, musical procedures that you commonly see. Stretto is when a subject is imitated before it's completed. It's almost like the voices are trying to beat each other in. So instead of giving one voice a chance to really completely say the theme, maybe the other voice will interrupt it halfway through, and then the other voice will interrupt it halfway through, and the other voice will interrupt it halfway through. It's called stretto. You have another thing called pedal point. That's where you have one note in the bass, and then you have it's held out while a bunch of other stuff goes on in the subject, or in the other voices. There are different things that you can do with a fugue. They can present themselves, we call it, in different ways. The whole point in a fugue is to be as creative as you can, and to try to put the theme in, or the subject in, as many times as possible without the listener getting bored. So you can do inversion, which is where the theme is turned upside down. You can do retrograde, where you begin with the last note and you work your way forward. You can do augmentation, where you have, instead of the normal rhythm that you'd play it, everything is slowed down. So maybe instead of quarter notes, you would use half notes. And you have diminution, which means maybe instead of using quarter notes, you use eighth notes. Everything is sped up. So you have different ways you can present the subject in a fugue. The most exciting one, I think, is to try to find at least, is the one in retrograde. That's always fun. We also have a piece called a prelude, which is a short homothic piece, so it's more chordal, and that introduces the fugue. So you often have preludes and fugues. We're not going to listen to the prelude that goes with the little G minor, but we're going to listen to the fugue. It's called the little G minor because there's another G minor fugue that's longer, and so this one is called the little G minor, and that one is called the big G minor. This one has 4 voices, so it has 3 in the hands and 1 in the feet, and each voice comes in and takes the subject until it gets gradually lower, and the last voice to enter is the pedal board with the organist's feet. So I'm going to give you a chance to listen to this one, and I want you to count. It's a fairly simple theme, and I want you to count how many times you hear the subject come in. It doesn't have to be the subject completed all the way through to the end, just how many times you hear those opening notes of the subject, and it'll get kind of crazy in the middle. This piece is played by the organ, and it is again by Bach. So take a moment, pause, and listen to the little G minor and count how many times you hear the main subject. All right, we're going to move on. Oof, I can. I lost my mouse. There it is. We're going to move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about opera. We're just going to we're not going to listen to any opera, but we're going to talk about how it kind of came into being. And it came into being because of a couple different things. One of them is something we talked about in the Renaissance, and it's the madrigal, and it's text painting. And you have composers that are wanting to do something new, and they're taking this madrigal and the text painting and the emotions and the drama, and they're bringing it to a whole new level and introducing something called opera. Opera is a drama that's sung to orchestral accompaniment. Often it's based on a Greek myth or tragedy. It's something that has lots of excitement, lots of drama. There's always people falling off buildings or people getting shot, sopranos hitting super high notes. There's elaborate sets that go with it, elaborate costumes, crazy singers. So opera is this invented in Italy, and it's this huge thing that's supposed to be a drama and a show. If you think back in the day, what did people have? They just come out of the Middle Ages, and they were wanting something new and bizarre. The nobility wanted something to display how rich they were and how much pomp and ceremony they had. And so this opera was a music that displayed how crazy society was and how rich the patrons are, what they could afford to put on. In an opera, characters and plot are revealed through song rather than speech. So it's basically a play, but instead of speaking, the characters sing things. And we'll talk about the reason they did this in just a little bit. But before we do, let's get some terms out of the way. The libretto is the text of the opera, and the librettist is the writer of the text. And then of course you have the composer setting to music. So the librettist writes the libretto and gives it to the composer, who then sets it to music. And the librettist and the composer are two different people. So when we talk about different people that write operas, we say Handel wrote an opera. Handel didn't write the text, Handel wrote the music, and the librettist wrote the text. We have different voice categories in opera, just like we had different voice categories, we had soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and a couple other ones in there. We have different divisions of soloists here. So we have what we call a coloratura soprano, we have a lyric soprano, and we have a dramatic soprano, and there's a difference between them. Your textbook gives them. Coloratura sopranos are the ones that sing really, really high. They sing high, they sing fast. They have lots of really fast notes. It's very showy. Lyric sopranos have a little bit of a lighter voice. It's not quite as powerful, and they usually sing roles that are more graceful. Dramatic sopranos have a full, powerful voice, your textbook says, and they're a little bit more, they sing a little bit more passionate roles. If we move on to tenors, we have two different kinds of tenors. We have lyric tenors and dramatic tenors. Lyric tenors have, they're kind of like lyric sopranos. They have kind of a light, bright voice. Dramatic tenors are like dramatic sopranos. They have a powerful voice. They're often heroic in the story. And then of course we have the bass part. We have the basso buffo and the basso profundo. And the basso buffo is the guy who kind of plays the comic role. He sings very rapidly, a little bit like the coloratura soprano, and he's the comedian of the show. Often operas are either so sad or so intense that you have to have kind of a comic character to make the people laugh, otherwise people will just go away being depressed. So you often have a basso profundo, a basso buffo that it takes the comic roles. And you also have the basso profundo, which is very, very low, very powerful. This is the person that has the dignity. This might be the father of one of the maybe it's the king, you know, the father of one of the girls or something like that, someone who has lots of dignity. So these are the different voice categories that we have in opera, and you'll get a chance to hear some of these as we go through. We also have what we call an aria, and an aria is basically just a song. So when you have someone that gets up and sings a song in opera, it's called an aria. That is different than what we call a recitative. Recitative is basically, it's singing, but it's singing to the rhythm that you would speak something. We'll hear examples of both of these in the next lecture, but just for the moment, know that you have aria, which is singing, just normal, and then you have recitative, which is sort of speak singing. If you've ever heard Handel's Messiah, you'll notice that sometimes it sounds like a normal piece, like a normal song, and sometimes it's almost like the person is speaking. Those are the differences between the aria and the recitative. If you would like to hear the difference between, go to YouTube and Google a recitative and just listen to it, and you'll be able to hear, I think, what we're talking about here. Notes that would receive more stress when we say them would get longer notes. Parts of the word that we would go through maybe a little faster, have faster notes, kind of goes through like that. We have what we call an ensemble. So we have soloists, we talked about those. We also have ensembles where you have 3 or more singers. If it's 2, it's called a duet. If it's more, it's called an ensemble. You have an opera chorus, which is of course the choir. Any group of people will either be an ensemble or a choir usually. You also have the prompter, who of course is important. He gives the cues and reminds people of words if they forget them. And you have what we call an overture or a prelude, sort of like we had the prelude that comes before the fugue. We have a prelude that comes before the main part of the opera, and it's instrumental, and it's what happens before the singers get on stage. So nobody's on stage, nobody's acting, so you have the overture or the prelude. Talk just a little bit about how opera came into being. We mentioned this. We have a group of people called the Florentine Camerata. Camerata is the Italian word for a society of people, a fellowship of people. And they met in Florence, hence we have the Florentine Camerata. And they weren't necessarily all musicians, they were just intellectuals of the day. So they had noble people, we have poets, composers, scientists, different people in Florence that got together to talk about stuff. And this group included the father of Galileo. He was actually a composer and he was part of the Florentine Camerata. And this group got together and they said, our music is boring, we need to come up with something more interesting. And it doesn't need to be just more interesting music, but it needs to be music that goes back to how the, surprise, surprise, Greeks did it. And they said, how did the Greeks do music? Well, the Greeks had these things called tragedies. So we want to fashion something after the Greek tragedies. So they had this idea that in Greek dramas, instead of speaking things, they were sung. Of course, we don't know what the Greek dramas were like because we weren't there, but that was their best educated guess. And so they said, we need to come up with something that's similar to that. So that is where opera came out. That is where the recitative came out, because they put speaking to music, shall we say. And the first opera that has been preserved that we have is Giudice. It was written by Jacopo Peri, and it was for a wedding. One of the Medici girls married King Henry IV of France, and it was performed in Florence in 1600. Several years later, Monteverdi composed the opera Orfeo, and this was the first, what we call the first great opera. It was the first, it was also based on the same play, Orpheus's Descent. If you know anything about Greek mythology, this will probably be a little easier for you. The Greek myth is that Orpheus descends into Hades after Eurydice dies, and he goes to Hades and he takes her soul back with him, or he tries at least. So you have these different operas, and the two that we have are the same opera. They're just called different things. One's called Orfeo after the guy, and one's called Eurydice after the girl. Opera reflected the creativity of the composers and the artists at the time, and also, like we talked about, it kind of stoked the ego and flattered the aristocracy, because there could also be symbolism in opera. You know, Apollo could be Apollo, or he could represent how amazing the king was. Apollo is the god of the sun god. And so he might maybe symbolize, as he did in France, maybe a prince's enlightened rule by the sun. The first public opera house was opened in Venice in 1637, and what you'll want to remember about this is that opera houses started opening in Italy in places where there was lots of trade. So you have Venice, you have Florence, you have these different places where people traded, and so you'd have people coming in from different parts of the world. They'd come in on these ships to trade, and while they're in town, they hear about opera, which is the latest and greatest thing. Or you have the nobility who are making their grand tour of Europe, and they come in and they want to know what to do in Florence or what to do in Venice. And opera is the next big thing. So they go to the opera, they rave about it, they love it, they take it back with them, and they start introducing it to the people where they're from. Opera was a scene. It was something that was supposed to be spectacular. And your textbook talks about this on page 118. It says, an English traveler wrote in 1645 about the opera and its variety of scenes, painted and contrived with no less art of perspective. There were machines for flying in the air and other wonderful motions taken together. It's one of the most magnificent and expensive diversions the wit of man can invent. Your textbook talks about some of the different machinery that they had. And keep in mind, they didn't have stuff like this. So the opera was the most exciting thing around. It was the biggest thing out there. You have gods descending on clouds. You have gods riding across the sky in chariots. You have backdrops with cities and arches. You have perspective with these great artists working on these backdrops for these paintings. And opera was a spectacle. It was the most amazing thing out there, and people loved it. They absolutely loved it. Baroque opera, one of the most interesting voice roles that we haven't talked about, was the castrato singer. And The castrato singer was sort of the most, he was the star of the virtuoso singers. And if you don't know what a castrato singer is, it is a male singer who was castrated before puberty and his voice hasn't changed yet. So he's a man with the voice of a boy. And often these castrato singers, they were used to play all kinds of different roles. Sometimes they were supposed to play a bit of a comic role. For example, one castrato singer played the role of Nero, and it was supposed to be sort of a jibe at Nero because it's a grown man, and he's singing this role of this guy who is obviously portrayed as a buffoon, an idiot. In this particular scene that I'm thinking of, the guy's Xerxes. Xerxes is sort of portrayed as a bit of an idiot, and he's singing to a tree in this particular one. It's actually a beautiful piece of music. It's gorgeous. We might have a chance to listen to it a little bit later on. You also have today's version of a castrato singer who is not castrated. They're called a countertenor, and this is a man who sings in a woman's pitch range, but he just kind of changes his voice and a little bit how he produces the sound to get what they're looking for, to get a countertenor sort of voice. If you want to know more about it, find a countertenor and ask them, or you can always Google it. It's kind of an interesting thing. I will put up, actually, the piece that I'll put up is the piece that I'm talking about. It was originally written for a castrato singer, but we have a countertenor singing it. You don't have to listen to it, but if you'd like to, you may. It's a piece by Handel called MI110, and I'll go ahead and put that up on the listening just so you can get a chance to hear countertenor and what they sound like. It's really interesting. If you have a chance, you should listen to it. We also have what we call dry recitatives or secco recitatives and accompanied recitatives. Basically, dry recitatives were just basso continuo and the soloist, and accompanied recitatives have the full orchestra that plays with it. We also have what we call da capo arias. This is the ABA form of arias. So da capo means head. So when we talk about da capo arias, you're going to, basically it's music that's written out. So you have theme A, theme B, and then you'll have the little words da capo, or the head. So you're supposed to be going back to the top or the head of the piece and repeating the first theme again. So it's A, B, and then instead of writing out A again, they're going to have you go back to the beginning and play it. And oftentimes, when you play it, you might add something exciting on your own, maybe add some extra notes or make it more dramatic. The composer that we're going to listen to in our next class, next week, is Claudio Monteverdi. He lived from 1567 to 1643, and he was born in Cremona, Italy. And if you look on the PowerPoint slide, you will see a map with where he was born. He served in the court of Mantua for, your textbook says it was about 21 years. He was a singer, he was the violinist there, he was music director there, and he ended up moving to become the music director at St. Mark's in Venice. And one of the reasons why he moved was because he wrote an opera, which is one of his earlier works. He wrote Orfeo in 1607. And it didn't really get a good response. He wrote, I have never suffered greater humiliation than when I had to go and beg the treasurer to obtain what was due me. So he had to go beg for the money for the opera. And so it wasn't a huge success, so he moved. He goes to St. Mark's, he goes to Venice, and he stays there for 30 years until he dies in 1643, and he writes for the church, for the Catholic Church, and he also writes for the first opera company, San Cassiano, in Venice, and he writes operas for them as well. And if you look on the PowerPoint, you can see a picture of San Cassiano, the building where it was. It's kind of cool. We're going to pick up here next week, and we're going to talk about his play his opera that he wrote in 1607 about Orpheus. We're going to talk about the plot, the Greek myth that goes along with it, and get a chance to listen to one of the movements from it. So not a whole lot of listening, but there's a little bit. Go ahead and listen to the two pieces that we talked about and see if you can have a little bit of time to listen to the countertenor as well. There is a quiz On the Renaissance, it is due tonight by midnight, depending when you watch this. It's due Friday night. I guess you could watch this over the weekend and it'll already be closed. So make sure that you've taken that. If you have any questions, make sure you email me. It is not open notes like the first one was. So email me if you have any questions about that, and I'll be happy to answer them.